deepen U.S. African commercial ties, investment flows, et cetera. And I can say for those of us who have a stake in this, and I think the world should, we have an uphill climb. A lot of the fundamentals have been a little bit difficult over the last few years. We've seen pretty significant devaluations in Nigeria and in Egypt, in both cases reducing profitability and investment interest from a lot of outside players. As a result of those, we've seen major U.S. exits of multinationals. In Nigeria, you can count Procter & Gamble, P&G left after almost 3 decades. You've seen a little bit of the stalling of some of the projects that were announced during COVID to invest, say, in Kenya, Moderna, in vaccine productions. So you see multinational, Western multinational interests decreasing. Meanwhile, the venture space, which was one of the highlights, has kind of leveled out at about 2.2 billion in FDI every year. So we have kind of a fundamental challenge of low investor interest relative to other regions. There are some, outstanding opportunities. Morocco's attracted a lot of investment globally, as has Egypt. If you look at the 160 plus billion that was attracted last year in FDI in the continent as a whole, Egypt and Morocco and Mauritania constitute the most. And of that, UAE has emerged as a major investor. The UAE project in Mauritania at 30 some billion in renewables is the largest of last year. So what that means is we need to work together to figure out new ways and new avenues. One that I'm most bullish on is in the critical mineral space, just because you've seen the emergence of critical mineral diplomacy in this Trump administration. Ukraine is a case in point. You also have a lot of very clear ways to articulate the mutual overlap of interests between the United States and African countries. Obviously, it's an area where Africa's riches and endowments meet global demand. So it's an area we're bullish on. We've started a critical minerals task force here at the Atlantic Council. It's about 1.5 years old now. And we're looking at ways to deepen investment along that vector. Likewise, you'll see a lot of interest still in the data center and connectivity space. So IT remains a big area. So Starlink can't even meet demand in the region, the data centers, et cetera. So those are the 2 sectors I'm most bullish on.
And who's across the chessboard from him? Some people are going to say Democrats, some people are going to say Russia, some people are going to say all the other actors. But to make it simple terms, President Trump sees China across the chessboard from him. And in the chessboard, Africa is a significant piece of whatever success the Americans want to have, the United States wants to have, as it sort of moves forward in the energy transition, as it moves forward to look at economic growth. Africa becomes a big component as we try to counter these things. And in fact, if you look at it under the lens of, you brought up Ukraine, Aubrey, rare earth minerals is top of mind. That is the clearest example of the role that Africa is going to play in this Trump administration and how it sees it. It sees across itself, on the chessboard from China. It sees resources in Africa. It sees resources in other countries, and it's going to, for the first time ever, it's going to, leverage the government to try to sort of go and seek those resources in a collaborative way. When you see what's going on in the Ukraine side is for the first time ever, the U.S. is creating a fund. Sort of a stand-up fund to deal with the excesses of the revenue that comes in, the profits of the revenues. So they're looking at the model differently than they've ever looked at it before. And I think that's an important thing to understand, and that's the leverage that Africa has, is you now have the resources. You've always had the resources, but you now have the urgency of those resources, and now you have an administration that's creating whole new models that have never existed on how to leverage those resources. And Ukraine is just one example. That's month 1. And so you're going to have multiple examples of this administration looking and leveraging it in new ways that we've never seen it before. Democrats certainly have never done the fund. Republicans have never done these funds. And these things are going to be apparatuses that tie us more closer economically. And I think from President Trump's standpoint, if he is across the chessboard from China, it's critical for him to have Africa as a key chess piece on the board with him. And so you're going to see more and more those opportunities to take place. You're right, it's gone, it's been tough. several years, but I think with this administration, as he sees it in more blunt ways, and he's less of the diplomat and more of the businessman. It's like, what do we need to do? What red tape can we cut through to make sure that we're having the conversations that we need to be having with these African countries? That it's not about other things that are going to take priorities. It's going to be about the economic relationships that we can have that rises both boats up.
For Media Advisors, we focus on the investment side. We were initially set up in 2016, actually through a collaboration with the U.S. Agency for International Development. But our focus was not aid. It was about investments and trade. Our mandate was to help bring significant investments in Africa through partnerships with U.S. pension funds, foundations, endowments. And the reason for that is because ultimately, the U.S. does not have the major public banks that the Chinese have to deploy into major infrastructure investments in Africa. So the tool that we have is our U.S. financial markets, our U.S. banks, our U.S. pension funds, our U.S. foundations to also invest in Africa's critical infrastructure space. The Government Accountability Office actually published a report just 2 months ago that showed that between 2013 and 2022, China deployed $680 billion in major infrastructure projects across the Global South. The US, throughout the same period, only deployed about $76 billion. And if you look at the Chinese investments, it was $250 billion in the energy space, $200 billion in transport, connecting markets to China, and another $200 billion in mining and industries. There was a $26 billion in communications, so setting up data centers and networks, connecting it through the Chinese standards and technologies. During this time, the US only invested about $76 billion. So we don't have the same tools that the Chinese have. So we need to be very smart about using what we have, which is financial markets, capital markets, instruments that the DFC can offer, such as guarantees, insurance, to help our investors invest in Africa's space. And that's the work that we've been doing over the last 8 years. We've deployed over $1 billion in collaboration with the DFC by leveraging US investors to invest in housing, in infrastructure. We're looking at mining, we're looking at data centers as well. So for our perspective, we're hoping that not aid, but trade and investments is the focus going forward. We're hoping that we have the tools at DFC, at US Exim Bank, to allow us to de-risk these transactions, deal with risk, currency risk as well, as you stated, Aubrey, but also to ensure that our investors are able to learn about these markets, are able to penetrate these markets, are able to compete, and ultimately are able to invest.
First is that this really could be an African century. It's a historic opportunity for us all, for Africans, but for all of us. 1 in 4 members of the global labor force, the largest proportion of young people in the world. This is an extraordinary opportunity, including for business and development. We should seize it. What does that look like? There are some upside possibilities and also some great risks. Maybe I'll start with the risks so that I can end optimistically. The Sahel has become the epicenter of global Islamic extremism, right? This year, this is quite extraordinary. Almost 22,000 deaths in the Sahel. The most lethal terrorist organizations in the world are operating out of West Africa. It's quite astonishing to me. I grew up in West and Central Africa, including the Sahel. The Sahel in the 1980s felt like about the safest place in the world. This is a great danger, primarily to Africans, but also to the world when that extremism is exported. We also know that there is gross corruption and misgovernance that is holding back development and opportunities, the former president of Senegal said. I know from running a democracy institute that investors have come to us and said, you know what, where there's good government and rule of law and transparency and property rights, I make a lot of money. Therefore, I want to support your work in Africa to help establish essentially the governance infrastructure for development and growth. It's actually quite strategic for us to invest in this. I'm all for everything everyone has proposed. We're never going to match China dollar for dollar in terms of state resources. What can we do when we think about the infrastructure of Africa for growth and development? We can actually invest in this government infrastructure, governance, that includes anti-corruption measures, transparency, legislative oversight, strong civil societies, free media that can hold leaders accountable. In African countries that have this, governance has produced actually quite striking development and growth. Let's invest in that. Let's also think about how we compete with China. China can come in and do corrupt deals with dictators, right? Those corrupt deals are much harder to do when citizens can hold governments accountable, when leaders have to answer to legislatures, when media can report on the transactions, when there are open tenders, public procurement, when there is rule of law, when there are secure property rights. All these things actually are what produce growth and broad-based prosperity.